Welcome to Christian Fellowship's weekly sermon podcast.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you here. It's great to see you out there in radio land, TV land. Let's pray. Father, would you cause your word to feed us today? Would you touch us in the places of our lives where we lack understanding? And would you give us wisdom? And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, someone has said that Ecclesiastes sounds kind of like a broken man you might see downtown who's constantly muttering to himself, and just somebody you sort of want to walk around and not listen to very long. When somebody else has said it's kind of like a guy that you wouldn't really want to hang out with very much, like you'd be saying, wow, I had a great weekend. And he'd say something like, yeah, but did it really matter? I mean, you're still going to die, right? You still have to go to work on Monday. And it's like, well, yeah, that's true, but I really did have a good weekend. Proverbs teaches us to trust in the Lord with all of our hearts and lean not on our own understanding. And then it promises us that God will direct our path. Now, we often tell people that are new Christians to read a chapter of Proverbs every day. And if you do that, you'll get through the whole book of Proverbs in a month, and you just start over the next month. And before very long, you have a lot of those Proverbs that have come into your heart that are helping you make decisions. The problem is, as good as that is, there's a point where you can begin trusting and leaning in on your understanding of the Proverbs rather than trusting in the Lord. I was a Christian less than a year, and I was visiting some friends, a man who was probably 10 years older than I am. I had great respect for him. And we were walking down the street together one day, and he said, well, you know, the Bible is not a cookbook. And I kept walking down the street, but in my head I was going, it's not? Because I really had by that time come to see how much I'd been doing contrary to God's will, and I was really counting on doing things according to God's will so there would be a little less confusion and pain in my life. But actually the book is called Proverbs. It's not the book of promises. And so what happens in Ecclesiastes is Ecclesiastes comes along and says, okay, so what you learned in Proverbs is not airtight. There's a bunch of exceptions, and you need to think about that and reckon with that. So Proverbs focuses on the norms and the rules, but Ecclesiastes focuses on the exceptions. It's a bit like Proverbs. You could compare Proverbs to meteorology, the science of the weather, but Ecclesiastes is more like what happens every day and not the forecast. Proverbs teaches us a principle. Disaster pursues sinners, but the righteous are rewarded with good. Disaster pursues sinners, but the righteous are rewarded with good. Now, if that's all you knew, and you were one of the friends of Job, you would find yourself on the wrong side of the Bible, right? Because you would be arguing with Job that clearly he is not a good man because disaster has overtaken him. That God would not be so unjust as to cause the things that happened in Job's life to happen to him. And Job keeps saying, no, I'm righteous, I'm innocent. And as a friend, you'd have to say, dude, You just have to look at your life a little more carefully, because I know what the Bible says. Ecclesiastes, in chapter 7, verse 15, it says, "In my vain or futile life, I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing." The guys in the black hats sometimes live longer than the guys with the white hats. The teacher in Ecclesiastes is relentless in taking apart the black and white formulas of our views of God and the world. The conclusion of Ecclesiastes is that life is hevel. It's a Hebrew word. Hevel. Hevel. Everything is hevel. Now, modern translations typically translate that Hebrew word into the word meaningless or futile. And in Hebrew, it literally means, as Donnie told us last week, it literally means smoke or vapor. Psalm 144 asks the question, "What is man that you, God, are mindful of him?" And then it goes on to say that man is like a breath, and his days like the passing of a shadow. Isaiah tells us that we're like the grass of the field, here today, gone tomorrow. Now that means that all that we see, all that we're surrounded with, is really like scenery on a stage. It will soon be taken down. Or it's like a hologram. It only appears to be there, but it's not solid, it's not real. But Hevel in Ecclesiastes isn't just about the illusion of what appears to be stable in our lives. It has a deeper meaning. In Ecclesiastes chapter 6, we read something like this. "Here is a tragedy I have observed under the sun, and it weighs heavily on humanity. God gives a man riches, wealth, and honor so that he lacks nothing of all he desires for himself." He has everything. But God does not allow him to enjoy them. Instead, a stranger will enjoy them. And this is futile or hevel, and a sickening tragedy. Again, in Ecclesiastes 8, we read, "There is a futility or a hevel that is done on the earth, and there are righteous people who get what the actions of the wicked deserve. And there are wicked people who get what the actions of the righteous deserve." Hevel, hevel, everything is hevel. He uses that word hevel 38 times in 12 chapters. Wealth, possessions, honor, those are the very things that Proverbs says you'll get by living in a wise way and fearing the Lord. And yet, if you've got them, you may end up hating your life, and you can't enjoy it. It's hevel. It's not meaningless. Rather, it's a paradox. It's not how the system is supposed to work, and yet that is how it's working at the moment. And Ecclesiastes tells us God gives some people this. This is how it works out sometimes. And then there are some people who have wealth and possessions and honor, and it's all great. They have big families, they're happy, they die at a ripe old age. But it's not true for everybody. sometimes when justice is done, good things don't happen. Bad things happen. And that's hevel. Some argue hevel should be translated absurd or enigma. It's a mystery. We can't see it. We can't get it straight. Proverbs doesn't give you the exceptions to the rule, just the rule. And Ecclesiastes comes along like the fine print in drug commercials that are read at triple speed. In some cases, this causes liver disease, arthritis, and rickets. Ecclesiastes says, let's talk about these exemptions, because they expose that things aren't as black and white as we want to think. They're hevel. And I think sometimes we read meaningless and we think, oh, it's a contradiction. Oh, life has no meaning. It doesn't mean that these two things are not reconcilable. It just means that we can't reconcile them. It means that we're not God. And I think that's why the writer of Ecclesiastes keeps saying, from here under the sun, which is a phrase he uses 28 times. From here under the sun, in this plane of existence, we look at life and what we see sometimes is absurd. Just because I can't see meaning in something that happens in my life, it doesn't mean that there isn't meaning. It just means that I don't have the perspective to see what it is. And I might never have that perspective while I'm living in this world. Tragedies do happen. Things don't work out. But it doesn't mean that God is not good. It just means that life is full of paradoxes under the sun. I remember in high school reading Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. You know, it was such a great book to read because it was so small. And it was such a compelling book to read. But you get to the end, and you've gone through days and days of this old man who's caught this great fish, probably a great marlin, bigger than anything anyone has ever caught. It hasn't sunk his boat, and gradually, he makes it to shore alive. But when he arrives, the fish has been totally eaten by sharks in the process. You go, ah. I'm a Disney generation guy. You're supposed to have a good ending, and this was not a good ending. Later I read the short story, The Open Boat by Stephen Crane. It's a great story. Stephen Crane is a reporter. He's on a steamship going to Cuba to report on an uprising that's there, and the boat sinks. And he and the captain and two other people are the last ones to get off the boat. They're in a tiny boat that will barely hold them. So the water is just inches there's just inches between the top of the boat and the water. And he's so good at describing it. And two of the people are injured. And so only the reporter and the sailor from the boat, the cook, they're the only two who are able to row. They spend 4 days at sea, 3 nights. And as they finally approach the shore, the little boat they're in is overturned by these terrible waves, and the waves keep crashing and crashing and crashing and crashing. And only the reporter remains alive. The other heroes of this story all drown in the sea. And it's like, When I got to college, I got to read The Plague by Albert Camus, which is another great story, but it's a book. And it's about how everybody in a town in Algiers dies of the plague. No one gets out. You get to know every person in town, and every person dies. So what I'm telling you is that by the time I got to college, the insanity of World War I and World War II had worked their way into the humanities. And the message was, it's meaningless. Nothing makes any sense. There was nihilism. There's no point in knowledge. It doesn't go anywhere. And there couldn't possibly be a God in the midst of all this insanity. Ecclesiastes is never quoted in the New Testament, but there is an allusion to it found in the book of Romans in chapter 8, starting in verse 18. Paul writes, I consider our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the sons of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. The word translated frustration is a word that's used in the Greek Old Testament to translate the word in Ecclesiastes that I've been telling you about, hevel. Creation was subjected to absurdity in hope, and it's waiting for the revelation of the sons of God in us. We started Ecclesiastes chapter 1 last week. I'm going to talk about we find in chapter 2 today. Just to refresh you, I'm going to read out of the New Living Testament, or the New Living Translation, sorry. Ecclesiastes 1 says, I devoted myself to search for understanding and to explore by wisdom everything being done under the sun. It goes on to say, I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. I observed everything going on under the sun, and really, it is all meaningless. It is all hevel, like chasing the wind. What is wrong cannot be made right. What is missing cannot be recovered. And so I set out to learn everything from wisdom to madness and folly. But I learned firsthand that pursuing all this is like chasing the wind. He says at the last verse of 1, the greater my wisdom, the greater my grief. To increase knowledge only increases sorrow. There were so many people I knew in undergraduate school who kept discovering this. The more we read about the world, the more we heard about the world, the more depressing it was, the more hopeless it seemed. And we were jealous of people who could go about life as if everything was fine. So in chapter 2, the teacher turns and he said, I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Wisdom only gets me down. Let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. But I found out that this too was hevel. So I said, laughter is silly. What good does it do to seek pleasure? So after much thought, I decided to cheer myself with wine. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. And in this way, I tried to experience the only happiness that most people find during their brief life in the world. For my generation, it was, let's get stoned. That's a good alternative. But he did this because he says he was guided by wisdom. So while he tried what was available to him for pleasure, he did it always as an experiment, always looking to see what was happening to his heart as he pursued these things. In a way, I'm sure he was a bit of an Epicurean or gourmet. He knew how to maximize the delight he took in, or he tried to take in whatever there was to partake of. He goes on and he tells us, I tried to find meaning by building huge homes for myself and by planting beautiful vineyards. I made gardens and parks, filling them with all kinds of fruit trees. I built reservoirs to collect the water to irrigate my many flourishing groves. I bought slaves, both men and women, and others were born into my household. I also owned large herds and flocks, more than any of the kings who had lived in Jerusalem before me. I collected great sums of silver and gold, the treasure of many kings and provinces. I hired wonderful singers, both men and women, and I had many beautiful concubines. I had everything a man could desire. And so I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me, and my wisdom never failed me. Anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. I even found great pleasure in hard work, a reward for my labors. This man lived better and celebrated life harder than anyone else. And he did it while retaining his mind. He kept his mind alert. He didn't need a stereo. He had people to sing to him. He didn't need DVDs or CDs. He had people to perform. He had everything a person could want. But in that life, that little paradise he created, when he had run the full gamut of pleasure, and he turned to contemplate these delights and the labor that it had cost him, he found still that it was hevel. It didn't work out the way he wanted. It wasn't satisfying like he expected it to be. It didn't meet the craving of his soul. And so he writes, but as I looked at everything I had worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless, hevel, like chasing the wind. There was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. Be a fun guy to be around, don't you think? So I decided to compare wisdom with foolishness and madness. For who can do this better than I, the king? I thought wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness. For the wise can see where they're going, but fools walk in the dark. So he found that out. And yet I saw that the wise and the foolish share the same fate. Both will die. And so I said to myself, since I will end up the same as the fool, what's the value of all my wisdom? This is all so meaningless. For the wise and the foolish both die. The wise will not be remembered any longer than the fool. In the days to come, both will be forgotten. And so I came to hate life, because everything done here under the sun is so troubling. Everything is meaningless, hevel, like chasing the wind. This is so different from what we read in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians 15, we read, "Dear brothers and sisters, be strong, be immovable. Always work enthusiastically for the Lord, for you know that nothing you do for the Lord is ever useless." But Ecclesiastes really doesn't focus at all on God's work of redemption. It's just primarily about life under the sun, life as men who live on this planet find it. So there's a number I want to bring to your attention. The number is 4,289 days. 4,289. I went online last night and I filled out a few questions, and this is the number of days that I have left in my life, I was told. There's a little app I have on my phone. It's a little white box. It has a black raven in it. I can put your name in it. I can tell it about what your BMI is, if you exercise very much, if you smoke, if you drink, and it'll calculate your days, and I can send you advice. It just tells me I need to exercise more. So I don't use it very often. My dad died in 2003. And it took weeks for me to not picture his lifeless body every time I closed my eyes. My father died at the age of 87. But he had been in my life so long that his disappearance from my life actually shook me. Once I found myself spacing out at a cash register at Walmart, and when I came back to reality, I realized I'd been imagining what the cashier was going to look like in her coffin. I actually did that to a lot of people. But it was a thing, I don't know if it was like a little boy thing, well, if my dad died, then that means everybody's going to die. I mean, intellectually, that was not new to me. But emotionally, it had this weight to it, what's the point? We're all going to end up lifeless. How many of you have seen the film Napoleon Dynamite? Well, not very many in here. I don't really recommend it. I hated it. But in order to communicate with my children, they insisted that we watch it. I hated it because all the shots were done in brilliant noon light. Nobody's pimples were covered up. Everything was bleak and stark. It happens, the storyline happens in Iowa. Everything's flat. There's no beauty. There's no anything. There was no nobility of man portrayed in the whole film. My kids thought it was hilarious. I thought it was terrible. So terrible, so disappointing. It's because I'm a Disney generation kid. I had this sort of romantic view of life. I want it to work out. I want it to be beautiful. I want to think well of people. There is beauty in life, and there is nobility in life, but there's also sin. And some of it's pretty stark and terrible. I think one of the things that has affected me the most as I've tried to understand the lives of our black brothers and sisters is that some of the stories that were precious to me are not entirely true, that there are elements that have been left out of them, things that I didn't know about. And now I have to try to put them together. I go, are there no heroes? Is no one good? Well, what does the scripture tell us? No, there's no one good, not one. Well, could we just pretend somebody is good for a little bit because it makes me feel better? Well, you can pretend all you want, but it isn't necessarily the healthiest thing for you to do. And so he goes on in Ecclesiastes 2. Having learned that actually working hard was satisfying, but then realizing despite all the hard work he did, he was going to die anyway, he says, I came to hate all my hard work here on the earth. I must leave it to others, everything I've earned. And who can tell whether my successors will be wise or foolish? Yet they will control everything I have gained by my skill and my hard work under the sun. How meaningless. What hevel. How absurd. So I gave up in despair, questioning the value of all my hard work in this world. He goes on, some people work wisely with knowledge and skill, and then must leave the fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it at all. This too is hevel. It's a great tragedy. And so what do people get in this life for all their hard work and anxiety? Their days of labor are filled with pain and grief. Even at night, their minds cannot rest. It is all hevel. And so he says, I decided there's really nothing better than to enjoy food and drink and find satisfaction in work. And then I realized that these pleasures are from the hand of God. For who can eat or enjoy anything apart from him? He decides the very best good that we can get out of life is that we have work, we have family, and we have food and a place that we can enjoy it. In other words, the very best we can do in this madness that we find under the sun is to recreate a little bit of Eden, a little bit where there's food and family and joy. God created us, and he gave us good gifts. And some of those good gifts remain, and so does joy remain. But there's a lot of things that compete for our attention and that promise us false things. Everything, according to Ecclesiastes, seems to be without meaning now, but there's still flowers. There's still things that are leftover beauties from the original world that can cheer our hearts. And so he ends with, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who please him. But if a sinner becomes wealthy, God takes that wealth away and gives it to those who please him. This too is meaningless, hevel, like chasing after the wind. So by the light of wisdom, by the end of chapter 2, he's learned that the hevel of pleasure and the insufficiency of wisdom. Wisdom has opened his eyes to see that he has to seek God in order to give rest, true rest, to his life. And wisdom has caused him to understand that life is so tangled that even the best mind cannot make total sense of it. At the conclusion of Ecclesiastes, we're told this about the teacher, that the teacher's words are like a goad at the end of a shepherd's staff. And sometimes shepherds would sharpen their staffs at the end so they could poke their sheep. I've never been around sheep, but I have been around cattle. And I have carried poles, and I have poked cows to get them to go where I think they need to go. And they're really good at going like that when you poke them. Kick you really hard. You have to watch out. But it also wakes them up. These goads for us, Ecclesiastes for us, is when we stand wide-mouthed, staring at the absurdity of something that's happened to us, and we don't understand. It's in the Bible, remember? Wake up. This is part of living now. You're in a fog. Life is lived in a fog, in smoke. And sometimes the smoke is so thick and the fog is so thick that you don't understand what's going on, or especially why it's going on. When I was a young man, I was angry a lot. I was angry because I thought too much and I felt too much. And I could not make sense of things. And I couldn't understand how the vast majority of people seemed to settle for so very little. And it wasn't until I encountered a loving and trustworthy God, a God who was behind all things, that I could actually find peace for my soul. I couldn't still understand things, but I could rest. So there's a gift. There's actually a goodness to things because I can't control them. It's a weird conclusion to come to. But if I can't control them and something really weird happens, what does it mean? It's not my fault. And when something really weird and bad happens to us, what's the first thing we think? Why is this happening to me? What did I do? The Bible is telling us there are things that are going to happen that are going to stun us. They're things that we can't understand and they're out of our control. And to find pleasure and peace in the things that we do understand. I came to a point in life where I realized some days I call them beach days. I'm really happy. I can remember things. I can remember people's names. I can have great conversations. Life is good. Despite the problems I faced yesterday, today is different than yesterday. And I'm not worried about those things. In my younger days, I'd start worrying right away. Why aren't you worried about the things you were worried about yesterday? Come on, be consistent. I let go of that. When there's a beach day, I go to the beach. And I have a good day at the beach. And I know it's given to me because I need to rest. Because the problems of tomorrow will be there when I get there. Despite what this author in Ecclesiastes does in exploring pleasure and finding life to be meaningless, he doesn't say, okay, let's go be hedonists because it doesn't matter. He goes, no, submit yourself to God, enjoy what God gives you, be at peace. Commit your way as to the Lord. Don't lean on your own understanding, and He will direct your path. Today, our 2020 class of seniors will be graduated from Christian Fellowship School. 10 years ago, on the last day of school at Christian Fellowship, the last day of school for my younger daughter, her classmate, Amanda McDaniels, died of bone cancer in the afternoon after senior chapel. Amanda had been diagnosed with bone cancer in her freshman year. I no longer remember if I got this because what I'm about to read to you, because of a class assignment I'd given to Amanda or in some other way. But I have kept it because as a 15-year-old, she was so biblically astute. So this is out of Amanda's journal. June 14, 2007. She writes, "There are times when I'll be thinking, this is how it should go. God got it all wrong. I know the best way. Even when I'm praying, if I think God is doing something that doesn't seem to be the right way, I will pray that he will, in essence, change his mind and take my advice. Not consciously, but that is what I found myself doing. I mean, when you think about it, what makes us think that we are right and God is wrong? He knows the exact number of the hairs on our heads, for goodness sake. I mean, in reality, though we are pretty sure we know what should happen, we are actually completely lost. But it isn't our job to make sure everything is going according to what we think is a good plan. It is our job to follow God's plan. Whose plan would you listen to? A person who has been alive for 15 years and hasn't even finished high school? Or probably even, who hasn't even finished high school, or probably even half the Bible? Or God, who's been there since the beginning of time, who knows everything about everything and is the author of the Bible? I think I will stick with God's plan. She ends with this prayer. Lord, please help me remember that you know what you're doing, and I need to trust you to lead me and fulfill your plan for my life. Amanda's death was hevel. It made no sense to any of us. It marked her classmates. They had to come to terms with it. Surface living really no longer appealed to them. And it marked all of us here in the church. Someone exclaimed at the moment of Amanda's death, "How could this ever be good?" I'm going to read something to you. You're going to be surprised to find out who it was written by. It doesn't really matter whether you grip the arms of the dentist chair or you let your hands lie in your lap. The drill drills on. Talk to me about the truth of religion, and I'll listen gladly. Talk to me about the duty of religion, and I'll listen submissively. But don't come talking to me about the consolation of religion, or I shall suspect that you don't understand. You will probably be shocked to learn that those words are written by C.S. Lewis as he was living out the rawness of his wife's death. And he was writing about hevel. The Ecclesiastes was written before the gospel was fully revealed. C.S. Lewis, on the other hand, he understood the gospel incredibly well, it seems. The gospel doesn't protect us from pain. In fact, it promises us it. As Amanda's family and friends discovered, the gospel doesn't protect us from hevel, from the dense fog of life, but it promises us to bring us through it.
That concludes this week's message. We invite you to check us out at christianfellowship.com.